Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's community chat hosted by United to End Homelessness with Orange County United Way. I am Becks Heyhoe-Khalil, the Executive Director of United to End Homelessness, and I want to say a huge thank you for joining us today for such an important conversation about what's happening at the federal level and what it could potentially mean for communities who are working to end homelessness around the country. Many of you are likely aware that over the last year, we have seen some significant changes being proposed at the federal level, from funding priorities to staffing and administrative shifts across multiple agencies, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, as you will likely hear us refer to that department during today's conversation. While 2025 was a year of proposed changes, 2026 is the year when communities are going to begin to feel the real impacts of these decisions. So to help us understand what's happening, what's at stake, and how local leaders can prepare, I'm honored to be joined today by Alex Visotzky, Senior Policy Fellow with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And in case you don't know who the National Alliance is, they are a nonpartisan organization dedicated to preventing and ending homelessness nationwide by advancing equitable, evidence-based, and socially just policies that strengthen communities. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us today. So to start us off, could you share a little bit about your role at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the overall work of the Alliance in supporting communities across the country?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bex, and thank you to United to End Homelessness and the Orange County United Way for having me. It's a real privilege to be here and be in community with you all. What the Alliance has been doing for the last 4 decades is trying to look at the data on the ground, look at the practices that are promising in communities around the country, and see what's actually working to end homelessness. And then we lift that up to our partners on Capitol Hill, and use that to really advocate for the policy changes and the funding so that we can replicate those promising practices, so that we can replicate what's working around the country. Um, and we also try to create spaces for communities to learn from each other, right? If something is working in Nashville, Tennessee, or Austin, Texas, or Orange County, we want other communities to be able to hear about that and learn from each other and talk to each other. And my role at the Alliance is really to lead our California policy work. And so that means both working on making sure folks on the ground understand what's happening federally, but also making sure our state is aligning with what works. Because we know that what happens in California tends to ripple out to the rest of the country. When California does good, smart policy choices, it ripples out. When California makes not so smart policy choices, it also ripples out too. So we want to ensure that, we're using that voice of best practices, bringing that voice of what does the evidence say to communities across California.
Such a needed position that you have. And I know that myself and our team have felt so grateful to learn from you and to learn from the work of the National Alliance. We've been to many, many conferences, headed down to the conference next week. And so very grateful for everything that the Alliance does to help those of us who are in this sector learn from each other. So we will dive into our first kind of meaty question and subject for our conversation today, Alex. And as I mentioned at the beginning, 2025 was a year when we saw a lot of changes being proposed. So could you give us a little overview of some of the changes that we're seeing at HUD and how they might influence how communities prevent and respond to homelessness?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's important before we talk about the changes to take a step back and really understand what HUD's kind of positioning and thinking has been on homelessness leading into this moment. For many years now, there have been two pillars to HUD's response to homelessness, and those pillars have been rooted in a bipartisan consensus that really emerged under the George W. Bush administration and then was built upon and continued upon through the Obama administration. The first of those pillars in HUD's approach to homelessness was a focus on ending people's homelessness with permanent housing, right? Housing with lease, with a door that locks, a space of your own. This is not to say that HUD was saying that temporary shelter is a bad thing, right? Shelter is an important component of a community's homeless response. But if we're seeing people leave shelters and go back to the streets or stay stuck in shelter for months and months on end, then we aren't really advancing the goal of reducing homelessness in a community. So HUD has really tried to incentivize communities responding to homelessness to focus on how are we going to get people into the permanent housing that ends homelessness. So that's one. The second is this idea of housing first. And I think housing first is an idea that's really been misunderstood. What housing first says is that simply, we're not going to put preconditions or hoops that you need to jump through before you can access the variety of housing and services that a community may have on hand in response to homelessness. There is overwhelming evidence that shows that when you layer on bureaucratic requirements or red tape before somebody can get into these programs, things like needing to participate in 6 months of treatment, or demonstrate sobriety for 3 months, while that may be something that you or I, find reasonable, it's actually really, really hard to do those things when you're living on the sidewalk and you're in constant fight or flight mode, and your focus is, where's my next meal coming from? How am I going to stay safe tonight? How am I going to protect belongings? And there's overwhelming evidence that shows when you get someone connected to a housing program without first making them jump through those hoops first, not only are they far more likely to get housed and stay housed, they're far more likely to actually make progress on getting the health care they need, on getting maybe the treatment and services they need, on recovering from, whatever it is that they're dealing with. So those two ideas, this focus on permanent housing and this using a housing first approach, those really animated HUD policy for many years. And we saw evidence that it worked. There's one population where we've really seen a focus on permanent housing and a focus on housing first at scale with robust availability of both the housing and the services, and that's with the veteran population. And between 2011 and 2024, we saw veteran homelessness decline by over 55% nationally. We saw it decline by 45% here in California. So even in a tough housing market like California, we saw that this approach can work. Um, did it get rid of homelessness, these approaches? No, of course. Of course not, because simultaneously, right, we've had an affordability crisis that continues to drive people into homelessness. But these approaches are showing that we can get people out of homelessness faster and faster. Um, so that takes us to now. HUD signaled last July in an executive order that was titled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets, a very sharp U-turn from this policy direction. Um, and an executive order doesn't necessarily make policy changes in and of itself, but it does signal the policy changes that are to come. And that executive order talked about the need to focus not on housing, but on getting people into treatment before we could get them into housing. It talked a lot about the need to enforce laws, things like camping bans, as a way to try and address homelessness. It talked about things like temporary shelters, things like transitional housing being more of where HUD wanted to focus rather than on permanent housing. And then again, this was a signaling device. We saw those policy changes really start to show up and be manifested in the most recent iteration of the Continuum of Care program, where there was a notice of funding opportunity that came out in November. And so I think we're going to talk about that a little more, so I won't dive too deep into that yet.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know we're going to get into kind of the meaty subject of continuum of care and no-fail funding. Alex, I think it could be helpful for our audience. As I think about the work of HUD when it comes to addressing homelessness, I think about the sort of two main entities in terms of public housing authorities and the continuum of care. Could you just provide the people who are tuned in with a little bit of kind of a breakdown about where do those programs of HUD exist? Because it's my understanding they're in different departments at HUD, but those are the two main entities. So as we're looking federally at these shifts, um, I think I'm making the assumption that public housing authorities is one of the main areas we need to be tracking, and continuum of care is another area to be tracking. So I'd love for you to just provide a little more color there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there are two kind of main branches of HUD that we're talking about here. One is called PIH. This is the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and that's where we think about the HUD's housing programs that really serve not just folks experiencing homelessness, but a much broader population. That's things like the Section 8 voucher program, right, that we hear about, where folks can get a voucher from HUD that helps pay a portion of your rent to keep you in housing. That also includes like the brick and mortar public housing programs that people have traditionally thought of as a hallmark of HUD. And then we also have this other branch, which is called SNAPS, the Office of Special Needs, and that's really where the homelessness programs lie. So we're seeing big changes coming to kind of both of these areas, right? In the PIH branch, the like larger public housing branch, we just saw HUD release a new rule that they're getting public comments on about mixed status families and trying to ensure that folks in those PIH programs cannot access housing if they are a mixed status family, meaning one of the members of the family does not have documentation as an immigrant. And so we're seeing major changes happening in kind of both of these branches. Under that kind of SNAPS program, that's where the Continuum of Care program sits. Um, and that's really been the primary source of federal funding for homeless housing. And when I say homeless housing, we're often talking about supportive housing. And what supportive housing is deeply affordable housing that also includes those wraparound services, things like mental health services, things like employment services that get somebody ready to re-enter the workforce. Those intensive services that can help get somebody back on their feet or at least get them to a place of stability and those services are so important, right? When somebody has experienced trauma or some trauma has led them into homelessness, to be able to have those services as part of the housing that they're moving into. So anyway, the COC program, that's the primary source of federal funding for that housing. In California, we have about 30,000 units of supportive housing that is funded by HUD's COC program. That includes 1,300 people in Orange County that are living in supportive housing funded by Continuum of Care dollars. And what has been a really kind of the hallmark of that HUD funding is stability. This is really important because state funding and local funding, it comes and it goes. Our budget in Sacramento fluctuates. Local budgets fluctuate. And so that year-to-year investment is not always there to fund supportive housing. Um, but if you're going to fund housing, you need funding that's stable, right? Because that consistent availability of services, that consistent availability of a rental subsidy that keeps somebody's housing affordable, that's why federal funding has been so critical. The COC program has been that, right? These buildings that provide sort of supportive housing count on that federal funding year after year so that they know that they're going to, be able to be made whole and keep serving the most vulnerable members of our community. Um, and what we saw in this most recent change to the federal Continuum of Care program, which happened in November, was an attempt to cap how much money could go towards permanent housing and could go towards supportive housing. And what that meant was hundreds of potentially across California, hundreds of millions of dollars dropping out of existing buildings that have already been built, that already are housing people that previously experienced homelessness and are relying on that affordable housing, relying on those services. Um, Money dropping out of those buildings and those buildings potentially not being able to operate anymore. Right now, about 90% of the money from the COC program across California goes to housing, including supportive housing. So capping that at 30% of the total continuum of care pot of money meant across California, $420 million dropping out of permanent housing. And across California, that meant potentially 27,000 people losing their housing. Again, this is not, folks like me and you getting an eviction notice, right? These are often folks who have struggled with mental health challenges, folks who have disabilities, folks who are older adults, people who have fled domestic violence, right? Folks that really need the support and need our support to be able to stay housed. The other thing that HUD tried to do here was penalizing communities for adhering to concepts like housing first, adhering to having racial equity policies in place, accepting LGBTQ folks in their programs. A lot of the things that have been central to what we, I think, stand for in California, and a lot of the things that are central to policy in California. And taken together, all of that together, that means, tens of thousands of people potentially losing their housing across California. Um, Currently, there's two parallel legal challenges that are arguing that what HUD is doing is illegal, that are working their way through a district court in Rhode Island. And so the judge in that case issued a preliminary injunction towards the end of 2025 that stopped HUD from moving forward with those new funding applications. But in the meantime, communities are in limbo, right? They're waiting to see if their grant programs that fund their buildings are going to get renewed. They're waiting to see if those contracts are going to be renewed. And right now, they're frozen. They're not seeing new money. Meanwhile, people still need that money to stay in housing. They need money to be able to operate these buildings. They need money to pay the service providers and the staff at the service providers that provide those services. So it's a very uncertain moment.
Thank you, Alex, for that rundown. You covered so much ground in that, so I really appreciate you giving us that kind of big overview of the importance of the COC funding, that federal funding that comes to local communities to help address homelessness. And here in Orange County, that is one of the largest sources of funding, as you mentioned. It's certainly the same for us in Orange County. It's been around 34 million. And normally that dollar amount that we've received here locally has increased every year. And as you mentioned, about 1,300 people here in our community who are in permanent housing, that potential cap would really, really have a very negative impact on. So I know that there's currently litigation that's going on right now, and so I know we can't dive too much into that. But I believe that next week there's a hearing, and so is that something for people who are watching to be paying attention to in terms of keeping their eyes and ears open for what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. We were hoping for a final ruling from the courts to come at some point in February. Um, and in the meantime, what we got was some through the appropriations bills that folks might have seen, there's been these shutdowns and there were spending deals reached by Congress and signed by the president early in February. As part of those spending deals, Congress provided some direction to HUD on the homelessness funding and said, if you don't get resolution of some of these issues, you have to start renewing existing contracts for this housing by certain dates. Um, so in response to that, what HUD said, HUD submitted a motion to the court and essentially saying, please dissolve the preliminary injunction. Um, and essentially said that, yeah, we'll renew funding for some of the contracts that are expiring in the early months of 2026, but we want to be able to proceed ahead with a notice of funding that is aligned with the notice of funding that we issued later in 2025, which was the subject of the lawsuit. HUD argued that there are no longer any immediate irreversible harms to service providers, to people experiencing homelessness and their communities because of the direction that Congress provided. Um, we, I should mention, so we strongly disagree with that assessment of the congressional language. As I mentioned, communities are still in limbo. We're already starting to see impacts roll in. I've been hearing about um, buildings where 40 seniors got eviction notices, where organizations that operate the buildings are walking away from the project because they just can't take the risk on anymore, and it's potentially risks their whole organization and much larger housing portfolio they have. So we disagree. We occurring. Resolving the preliminary injunction would not be the right move at this moment, and allowing HUD to move forward with those policy changes. So there will be a hearing in the next couple weeks to discuss that very issue and see if the judge agrees with HUD on that factor. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Definitely something to keep an eye out. And there's so much swirling right now. And so I don't want to kind of spend time kind of hypothesizing about what might happen, what's going on, because I think with the way things that are going, it would be great to chat with you after the next hearing. We can kind of take it from there. But I do want to come back to what you mentioned about Congress and providing that direction to HUD for funding. There was significant advocacy efforts that happened. And so could you share a little bit about some of the advocacy that we saw happening nationally? I know locally, our team was heavily involved in asking people to reach out to their representatives. And I'm sure that many of the people who are watching signed letters requesting for their representatives to help protect that COC funding. And so I would love if you could just share, your insights on that movement that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say that on that advocacy, Orange County showed out. I know there were thousands of letters submitted to your members of Congress in both parties, about just how critical it is to protect homelessness funding. And without that advocacy coming from your community and coming from communities across the country, we wouldn't have seen this language in Congress putting some guardrails on the homelessness funding. We didn't get everything that we were hoping for, right? There was stronger language we would have liked to see. But Congress dictating a timeline where HUD has to start renewing contracts regardless of what's happening in the court case is a really big win, and is a big win, thanks to that advocacy. Members of Congress are getting so much advocacy on so many different fronts right now. Deep cuts to healthcare because of HR1, changes to SNAP, immigration enforcement that's happening in our communities. Um, so it's no small feat when they actually put something high up on their agenda and take action on it. Um, and so seeing Congress take action, putting some guardrails to put some level of stability in funding, is really meaningful. I think the question is, are they going to continue to try to push HUD and try and ensure HUD is complying with their language that was in the appropriations bill? Will they issue further instructions? How are they going to respond to, the president's going to put out a budget proposal in the coming weeks? How are they going to respond to that? That means we need to kind of keep the advocacy going and keep it on the front burner for these members of Congress, right? Because again, they're getting dozens, hundreds of phone calls, emails about a whole host of issues every day. Um, and so while we're kind of in limbo at the moment, we need to tell our members of Congress in both parties, and I want to emphasize both parties, right? This language that was in the spending bill was the result of a deal between Republicans and Democrats who are both deeply concerned about this. So we can't write off any of our members of Congress because they might disagree with us politically. When they're hearing from a lot of their constituents, they know their political survival depends on doing something. Um, so we need to keep the pressure on them, keep telling them, hey, we haven't seen any movement from HUD on the directions that you gave them. Hey, we haven't seen any movement from HUD on making sure that people aren't evicted from that supportive housing building down the street, and we want to see those folks continue to stay housed. So we need to keep our voices, in the ears of our members of Congress.
Absolutely. Thank you for that important reminder that now is not the time to drop the ball on any of this. And for anybody who's watching who maybe hasn't attended one of our Advocacy 101 classes before, just want to invite you. That's a great place to learn a little bit more about how to use your voice. We make sure that we provide these incredibly important opportunities to advocate for funding for solutions to homelessness here in Orange County. And so that's a great entry point if you've never taken one of our classes before. And Alex, I know our time is disappearing from us. And so we didn't get to talk too much about what's happening at the state. So I would love if maybe we could just pivot there as you're looking at the state and what's happening. What should be on people's radars for what's going on here in California?
Yeah, we've shown in California in recent years that when we spend money on the things that we know work, we can actually start to achieve progress, right? California is by no means out of the woods on homelessness. Anybody walking down the street knows that. Um, but significant investments in programs like the HAP program, which sends money to local communities for things like housing, um, has helped bring a lot more people into housing. Since the beginning of 2023, across California, we've seen 90,000 people permanently housed thanks to the HAP program. That's a big reason why homelessness skyrocketed while it was skyrocketing in the rest of the country, stayed relatively flat in California. Homelessness rose 8 times faster outside of California from 2023 to 2024, which I don't know why the governor's not touting that number left and right. Um, we're at risk of losing that progress, though. Every year we start, I mentioned state funding goes up and down. Every year we start with a budget of zero on homelessness, and we have to fight with our state legislature and with our governor to ensure that money's in there. Um, Fortunately, some of our elected officials from the Orange County community, Assemblymember Quirk Silva comes to mind, have really championed continuing to ensure the state is funding homelessness. But we're at risk of losing that funding with a tough budget year here in the state and with a deficit here at the state. So as we keep our pressure up on the federal elected officials, we also need to stay in the ears of our state elected officials and let them know how critical that state funding is.
Thank you so much for that reminder, Alex. And I know we're at 12:30, but I have one last question that I want to ask you, and
Yeah,
then
of
I'll wrap
course.
us up. Um, so there's a lot of change going on right now, and for everybody who's watching this, I would love to just hear, like, from you, what's your advice? What would be one piece of advice that you would offer around navigating uncertainty and change that is going to be inevitable for 2026? What would that be?
Yeah, it's inevitable for 2026. It's probably inevitable for a couple more years beyond that, right? The uncertainty and change will absolutely continue. What is constant, right, is that across our state, there's tens of thousands of people that get up every morning and are doing the hard work to serve our most vulnerable neighbors every day, including many people who are formerly homeless and decided rather than close the book on that chapter of their life, they're going to get back into the work because they want to help others and lift others out of homelessness. There's thousands of people just like you who care, right, and want to plug in and help. I think it's remembering that, right? It's remembering that we are not alone by any means in this work. We are not alone in this fight, and we don't have to do it all by ourselves, right? We don't have to be alone. We're a community and a movement that is deeply committed to this work, and that's going to endure beyond, this Congress, this administration, this governor, whatever it may be. Um, there's an army of people out there who care and are right there alongside you, willing to do that work. So just keeping that in mind whenever we're kind of despairing or struggling with the change is that's a constant. Those neighbors, those friends that do the work with you.
Oh, that's so true. And Alex, you reminded me in December, we did an event in partnership with the Orange County Soccer Club and the service providers here in Orange County, where we actually gathered together and had this just beautiful display of solidarity. It was a foggy, misty morning here, and a couple of hundred people still came out, which in Orange County, California, we don't do weather. We came out together and formed this beautiful created art together. And so I know that the link to that is going to drop in to the chat box. And perhaps if we have time, we might play this video at the very end and share it on screen as a beautiful way to close out our time together. Um, I think some of the things that I'm walking away with from our conversation is now is the time to stay active in our advocacy efforts, both at the federal and at the state level. And another piece of that is that our advocacy has worked. Our voices have been heard. And so that, I think, just thank you, Alex, for highlighting the importance of that collective advocacy work that happened nationally. And a huge thank you to everybody locally in Orange County who joined in the collective efforts to help see some of the results that we're seeing. But as you mentioned so clearly, the work is not done yet. A huge thank you to everybody who tuned in today, to those who submitted questions in advance that helped shape this dialogue and conversation. Um, and then a quick little poll will pop up on the screen. We take your feedback seriously. We use it to help shape future agendas. And so please provide your feedback on that poll. But I'm so grateful for this conversation. And I know that together, by staying informed and engaged, that we can continue working towards a future where everybody has a safe and stable place to call home. Thank you.